Last week, Jamar Chase, Joe Burrow, Kirk Cousins, Drake London, Darnell Mooney, Garrett Wilson, and Tucker Kraft went off in fantasy football and helped people win their matchups. Well, and this week, I'm bringing you 10 players who will do the same, guys that will win you your matchup. And the last one might be controversial, but I think I have good rationale behind it. My hit rate through 5 weeks is 63%, so let's keep it rolling. Starting off with one of the most disappointing running backs in fantasy football this year, but they are going to bounce back in a huge way here in week 6. We're talking about Bijan Robinson at the Carolina Panthers, my RB4 on the week. Carolina is the best matchup for your fantasy running back when you adjust for schedule and you look at fantasy points allowed per game. The Panthers this year, Alvin Kamara had 22 points against them. J.K. Dobbins, one of his best games in the last, 3 years? Chase Brown had a career game, 2 touchdowns, his first and only 2 touchdown game. Zach Moss also went off in the same game, and DeAndre Swift bounced back as well. 20 fantasy points last week versus this team. The Panthers defense in 2024 is top 6 in rushing yards allowed per game, total yards allowed per game, and they give up the most points to opposing offenses, over 33 points per game. Guys, on average, the Panthers are giving up almost 5 touchdowns worth of points per game. And look, I completely understand if you're out there and you're saying, look, I hate his usage. Why are they using Tyler Algier? And I get it. If you look over the past 5 weeks, the usage has definitely been frustrating. However, I think this week in particular, the game script will heavily favor Bijan and these running backs. It's a very healthy over-under, lots of points expected, and the Falcons have the 3rd highest implied team point total on the week. So we could see a scenario where the Falcons are able to run the clock off in the second half. Their implied team total is 27 points here versus the Panthers. So this is a week that Bijan reminds people who he is. All right, I'm betting on it. It's a bounce back week. 80 plus total yards, a touchdown, and 16 plus PPR points. Hasn't been really in the red zone, in the end zone. So I think that changes this week. All right, the second player that's going to go off, Terry McLaurin, baby, at the Baltimore Ravens. The Ravens secondary is Swiss cheese right now. Everybody's open. Baltimore is the second best matchup for your fantasy wide receiver when you adjust for schedule. The Ravens right now, think about this so far on the year. Rashee Rice had 17 points against them. Davante Adams had his one good game this year against them. Jamar Chase had 41 points last week, and also T. Higgins with 29 points, 4 touchdowns total to those 2 wide receivers alone last week. And the Ravens defense, like I said, giving up the 2nd most passing yards per game and the 7th most total points allowed per game. And this game, I want pieces of this game. A high over-under, 52.5 points is the over-under this week. That is tied for the highest over-under of the week. And it makes a lot of sense why Vegas is predicting a high-scoring game, because these 2 offenses right now are the leading offenses in the NFL. As in, no teams score more points per game than Washington and then Baltimore. Right now, Washington is the only team averaging over 30 points per game. So I think Terry continues his hot streak with Jaden Daniels. 6 catches, 70 yards, at least 15 PPR points. And I'm not predicting it because touchdowns are hard to predict, but I think he could get into the end zone. All right, this takes us to my spicy hot bold take of the week. In week 6, both DJ Moore and DeAndre Swift finished top 12 at their position versus the Jacksonville Jaguars, and each of them are going to put up at least 15 PPR points. Let's start with DeAndre Swift. Jacksonville is the 3rd best matchup for your running back when you adjust for schedule. And by the way, shout out to 4 for 4. Every matchup we look at today, we will be looking at adjusted schedule fantasy points allowed, right? That's the most accurate way to do it. Now, 3rd best matchup for running backs, okay? And we had DeAndre Swift on this video last week. It panned out really well. This is another great matchup to chase. And if you look at running backs so far this year against this team, Devon Achane, 23 points. James Cook, 18 points. And last week, if you remember, we told you to start Trey Sermon on this very video, and he goes out and has over 18 fantasy points. And we mentioned this last week when we talked about DeAndre Swift on the video, but the reason I have so much confidence in him is because the identity of this team has completely changed over the last 2 weeks. They went from a pass focus to a run focused offense, which has made Swift kind of the focal point of the entire offense. I mean, let's look from weeks 1 to week 2 to week 3, all the way up. I mean, his touches per game have gone up and up and up from 11 to 19 to 17 and 23 touches per game in each of the last 2 games. And you can see further proof here in their drop back rate. And that is basically the percentage of plays where they have dropped back to throw the ball. So in the first 3 weeks, you're hovering around high 60s, 70% of the time you're dropping back to throw the ball. Now, in the last 2 weeks, that's more around 50%. They are asking Caleb Williams to do less and less each week. And look, while they're throwing less, the run game is opening things up for them down the field. They are more efficient as a passing offense. So this is great for DJ Moore as well, because you can see in the last 4 or 5 weeks, Tyreek Hill had his best game versus his team. Nico Collins had over 33 points. And in the same game, Stephon Diggs almost 19. And even Josh Downs last week, almost 16 PPR points. The Jags defense is top 3 in total yards allowed per game and total points given up per game. And honestly, look, their rush defense isn't even that bad, but their offense is not able to stay on the field, and that means everyone is scoring against them. So again, we're predicting 15 plus PPR points for both of these guys, and both of these guys finishing as top 12 players at their position. The fifth player we think is going to dominate, that is Trey McBride at the Packers. Look, I'll be honest, is it a cop-out? Maybe. You can say it's a cop-out, but he is my tight end one this week. He's the tight end that I have the most confidence in this week. Ultimately, the tight end position is so impossible to predict from 1 week to the next, but I love this matchup. Let's talk about it. The Packers are the 5th best matchup for your tight ends when you adjust for schedule. And just last week, we saw Colby Parkinson get 7 catches for 52 yards, 12 points. That's a real, I mean, if you had 12 points per game right now from a tight end, come on, don't lie, you would be obsessed with that. And to be honest, I believe Trey McBride is just waiting to explode in fantasy football. Why? Because his utilization is elite. In 2024, let's look at this. Route percentage, the percentage of his team's routes that he's run, he is 4th amongst tight ends. He is 1st in targets per game, 1st in targets per route run, and 1st in target percentage, and 3rd in air yards. I mean, every metric that you look at to say, is this guy a focal point of the offense? Trey McBride is pretty much leading the way, and this is another game that Vegas is predicting will end with a lot of points on the board, 49.5 point over-under. I think we get at least 6 catches, 60 yards, and over 12 PPR points. I think Trey McBride is a must start. All right, so earlier we talked about how Bijan Robinson was going to bounce back this week. Well, another running back that was taken in the first round who's been a disappointment is also going to bounce back. That is Breece Hall versus the Buffalo Bills. I'm giving you that confidence to go ahead and continue to put him into your lineup. My RB10 on the week. Buffalo is the 2nd best matchup for your running backs this year. And they gave James Conner 19 points. They gave Devon Achane his best game of the year, 29.5 points. Derrick Henry had over 200 total yards, 36 fantasy points. And even last week, Dare Ogunbowale, who was used in the air, had almost 15 PPR points. And we know Breece Hall gets used in the air. This Bills defense right now is giving up the 7th most rushing yards per game, and they allow the highest yards per carry, over 5 yards per carry against this defense right now. It's absolutely bananas. And I completely understand, like with Bijan Robinson, the concern around Breece Hall's usage. Each and every week, Braylon is starting to eat into that workload. However, like we mentioned before with Dare Ogunbowale, teams that throw the ball to running backs versus the Bills are very successful. And the good news for Breece is that his floor is so safe because of that target share. Right now, he leads running backs in targets. He's tied with Alvin Kamara for the most targets amongst the running back position. I'm predicting at least 80 yards, 16 plus touches, and 15 plus PPR points. And I think he could get back to the end zone. But look, that's not something that you can really predict each and every week. All right, the 7th player that we are excited to play this week is Diontae Johnson versus the Atlanta Falcons. My wide receiver 21. Atlanta, when you adjust for schedule, is the 12th best matchup for your fantasy wide receivers. They gave Devonta Smith his best game of the year, over 20 points. Rashee Rice had 29 points versus his team. Chris Olave, who's been a bust most weeks this year, he had 87 yards versus this team. Mike Evans had 2 touchdowns last week, over 23 fantasy points. And look, last week, if you started Diontae Johnson, look, it wasn't good. We have to be aware. But we underestimated the Chicago Bears secondary. That is the 3rd worst matchup for your fantasy wide receivers. So it shouldn't be a surprise that he busted last week. And keep in mind that in the last 3 weeks, with Andy Dalton starting, Diontae Johnson is averaging more points per game in that span with Andy Dalton, more points per game than Stephon Diggs, Terry McLaurin, Garrett Wilson, Mike Evans, CeeDee Lamb, DK Metcalf, and Chris Godwin. So I know the recency bias might tell you, oh, maybe we shouldn't start Diontae Johnson. But as long as Andy Dalton is our starter, we're putting that guy out there in plus matchups. I'm predicting 7 catches, 70 yards, and at least 15 PPR points. All right, the 8th player, this is my quarterback streamer of the week, Justin Fields at the Las Vegas Raiders. The Raiders are the 8th best matchup for your fantasy quarterbacks. Lamar Jackson went off versus this team. Andy Dalton had his best game in years, 3 passing touchdowns. And last week, Bo Nix, rookie Bo Nix, who people were memeing on this entire year, has 3 touchdowns, no turnovers, almost 25 fantasy points. It was Nix's first game with multiple touchdowns. And this Raiders defense right now is allowing the 5th most points per game to opposing offenses. And it's just gotten worse for Las Vegas. Why? Because one of their best defensive players behind Max Crosby, Christian Wilkins, who they signed in free agency, suffered a serious foot injury. He'll be out for a long time. And Justin Fields has really picked it up in the last 3 weeks specifically. In the last 3 weeks, Justin Fields is averaging more points per game than Dak Prescott, Baker Mayfield, Josh Allen, CJ Stroud, Kyler Murray, and Jalen Hurts. I'm predicting 250 plus total yards, that's throwing and running, 2 touchdowns, and 18 plus PPR points. All right, the 9th player, we are starting with confidence. That is Tony Pollard versus the Colts. Colts are the 5th best matchup for your running back this year. James Conner had 26 points versus them. Josh Jacobs had 151 rushing yards. He didn't get into the end zone, but he dominated this defense. Tank Bigsby had his best game as a professional last week, almost 26 fantasy points. And the Colts defense right now, I mean, there are lanes everywhere. These guys are just laying down every play. Would you like to run on us, sir? Go ahead. Here's the best path forward. They're giving up the 2nd most rushing yards per game. They're giving up the most yards per game as a defense. Over 400 yards per game. They're the only defense in the NFL giving up over 400 yards per game. Not only is this matchup good, but Pollard has been getting workhorse usage. Shout out to Fantasy Life and their utilization app. You can see Tony Pollard has a better utilization as a workhorse than Bijan Robinson this year, than Derrick Henry this year, than Jahmyr Gibbs. When you look at those key metrics, team rushing attempt share, targets per route run, Tony Pollard is leading the way amongst those 4 names. I think he gets at least 20 touches, which is a high number. I'm being bold here. 16 plus PPR points. And man, I think he's set to really, really go off. All right, the 10th player. And there's a lot to dive into here. Chris Godwin at the Saints. Okay, so technically, this is not a good matchup. All right, if you look at the numbers, this is not a good matchup, but I believe this player is going to go off, and here's why. First things first, let's look at wide receivers who have succeeded versus New Orleans. CeeDee Lamb had 19 points, Devonta Smith with 15, and Juju Smith with over 20. What do you notice about those 3 wide receivers specifically? Well, for me, they spend a heavy amount of their snaps in the slot alignment. And thankfully, we know that the Bucs finally put Chris Godwin back into the slot this year, and he is thriving as a slot wide receiver. Career high in yak per reception, career high in yards per route run. And historically, Mike Evans, that is, has not produced versus Marshawn Lattimore. Marshawn Lattimore lives rent-free in Mike Evans' head. Have a look at this. Shout out to Ian Harditz, who put this tweet out. Mike Evans, 12 career matchups against Marshawn Lattimore. We have 1 good game, and the rest of them are pretty shocking. I mean, Marshawn Lattimore, his entire being is built around stopping Mike Evans. We just know that, right? And conversely, Chris Godwin has dominated this team in the last 4 games where he has been healthy. Shout out to Chris O'Brien over on Twitter. In the last 4 games he's been healthy, 19, 17, 14, and 28 fantasy points. I'm predicting 6 catches, 70 yards, and over 15 fantasy points here in week 6 for Chris Godwin. All right, so those are 10 players that I believe are going to dominate this week. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe if you like the content. I'll have my bust videos out tomorrow, so players that should bust, or could bust rather. And the last thing I'll say is if you have a difficult start-sit question this week or a trade that you want answered, go ahead and check out the pinned comment. There's a link there to our website where at any time you can reach out to us and get an answer with your questions. You can also get your team reviewed. And if you haven't signed up for a free account over on the Flock Fantasy site just yet, use a promo code LAND at sign up. You can get access to some free tools like the trade calculator, the league analyzer, and some expert consensus rankings. I appreciate y'all for being here. Do me a favor, hit that like button. Go get a win here in week number 6. Now that those idiots are done talking, who needs some rankings?
Hell yeah, I need some rankings.
Then use promo code LAND, LAND, for 30% off any membership at flockfantasy.com.
Oh.